Okay, I think we can get started. I'm Fred Murphy. I work with the Marxist Education Project and very happy to welcome you to talk by Thea Riofrancos on Extraction, the Frontiers of Green Capitalism. Just one housekeeping note. I put a notice in the chat that just clarifies our recording policy for this evening, so you can take a look at that at your convenience. And we'll without further ado, get started. Thea is the Associate Professor of Political Science at Providence College. She's a strategic co-director of the Climate and Community Institute and a fellow of the Transnational Institute. Besides Extraction, her new book, she is also the author of Resource Radicals, From Petronationalism to Post-Extractivism in Ecuador, and the co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. Her writings appear frequently in scholarly journals and in publications such as the New York Times, the Financial Times, Foreign Policy, N+1, Dissent, and others. So Thea is going to talk for a while about the book, and then we will have plenty of time for conversation, questions, and comments from you, the audience. So I'll turn it over to Thea.
So this presentation is inspired by the book and the research that led up to it, but it doesn't, and it overlaps with it a lot, but it's taken from a slightly different angle because I think that people in this room, whatever your background or level of experience, have a bit more formation in terms of political analysis than random person on the street does. So I'm not assuming a baseline of 0. That means there might be moments that it's a little complex, but there are other moments that I think are going to be very straightforward. But I will now get into it a little bit. So the main topic of the book, and for anyone that even read the description of the event today or has read any of the book, this is pretty clear, is about the mining linked to the energy transition. Of course, there's mining for all sorts of other purposes in the world, which is part of the point of today's talk is whether we analyze those two things differently, whether extraction or extractivism in general is different for this extraction that's specifically linked to the energy transition. But in general, my focus is lithium battery supply chains, lithium batteries, and the lithium mining that goes into them. And lithium batteries, as people may know, are kind of a critical technology of the energy transition. There are other ways to store energy, and there's other battery technologies, but for a variety of reasons that I can happily discuss more, lithium batteries have been the prevailing approach to, first of all, rechargeable batteries, like in anything, your laptop, but also energy storage for the energy transition. And there are kind of two main applications of that. One is what we're looking at right now, which is batteries for electric vehicles. That's what this is modeling for us. And it's saying, for those batteries for electric vehicles, we'll need 400 new mines in the next decade. That doesn't include the body of the car or solar panels or transmission lines or wind turbines or any other like physical build out of the energy transition that requires mined materials. So this is not all of the mining for the energy transition. It's just a subset, or kind of maybe a small subset of it. If we think about the steel and aluminum that make a car, or an electric vehicle, or a wind turbine, or anything else, transmission lines, etc. Those, each of those little mines is a physical place in the world. So where I did a lot of the research for the book was in Chile. It wasn't the only place I did field work, but it's one of the main ones, or the place I spent the most time. And so this is the Atacama Desert in Chile, which is where about 20% of global lithium currently comes from, and is actually potentially expanding right now, the amount of mining there. There are two main mines in the Atacama Salt Flat, which is the largest salt flat in Chile and the third largest in the world. And you may already be wondering, like, what type of mine is this? It depends, if you read a little of my book, you'll probably know. But Otherwise, this might look a little unfamiliar because it's not like a traditional hard rock mine, but it's a type of mine that relates to the fact that lithium can take the specific form of being in salt water, in briny water that's underneath the salt flats in various places in the world, but Chile is a top producer, as I said. And this salt flat is also a, beautiful natural landscape where flamingos live and migrate, where other species live. The lagoons that you see the flamingos kind of standing in are also filled with smaller organisms that the flamingos are eating. So
Sunday,
this is just
3:38
about.
p.m. Hi, this is Adam
Sorry,
Bunkadeka. I
someone
wanted
has
to
a
call you
sound on. I'm not
personally.
sure who it is.
I officially launched my campaign for New York State Comptroller
Stand by. I'm going to try to mute that person, whoever they are.
to delete all old messages. Press all.
Okay, Thea, you'll need to unmute because I just muted everybody. Don't know what that was about, but we're good.
Sorry, I couldn't actually access that button myself. Okay. So can people hear me now? I think so.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm gonna proceed. So there's a whole natural landscape on this same salt flat that is where these lithium mines are. It's not just like a pure extraction zone, whatever that might mean. It's also a habitat. And even the lithium-rich liquid is actually itself a habitat because there are microorganisms that live in that brine, even though it's underneath the ground, and therefore, these are organisms that use chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis. So everywhere that you look, there is life. Life finds a way, as they say. Um, but in addition, there are people, not just, non-human nature. There are people not that live in the salt flat, because in the actual salt flat, there isn't immediate fresh water. But there, around the perimeter of the salt flat, the freshwater aquifers begin. And so you have human communities for thousands of years, indigenous communities and peoples that have lived in this region. And right now, specifically, there are 18 distinct Atacameño, that means from the Atacama, indigenous people that live around that one large salt flat. And all of this is under threat to varying degrees by lithium mining, which impacts the water system, impacts biodiversity, copper mining, which I haven't mentioned. It's not the focus of my research, though it's something I'm knowledgeable about and can speak to. But copper, Chile is the number one copper producer. It's the number two lithium producer and number one copper producer. And the copper is also nearby. And the freshwater needs of the copper industry compound these harms as well. And all of this current extraction for lithium, for example, and planned extraction or forecasted extraction for other energy transition minerals is on top of, an already like planetary mine. And I know in a prior iteration of this reading group, maybe a few years ago, some people read that book, the book called Planetary Mine. So I'm kind of taking that phrase from Martin Arboleda. But this is showing that there are 66,000 square kilometers of mines, covering the Earth. That is actually, in a way, an understatement, as the authors of this study say, because it would multiply by many factors of magnitude if we include the actual whole land footprint that's affected by mining, not just like the immediate physical plant of the mine, because obviously contamination and other disturbances to the land and pollution of it travel much farther away. So, a name for what I just described over the past 5 slides is green extractivism. And that's a term that I use in the book. It's a term that sounds perhaps very jargony in a way, like an ism, a long, complicated word, but it's not, in a sense. In the way that I learned it, it was really from activists in Latin America, from frontline community activists. And so ordinary people, working class people, environmental activists in the Americas use this term extractivism and use the term green extractivism to talk about what I just mentioned. And I'll define all of this basically starting right now. So don't worry if you've never heard these things before. But, a simple way to define green extractivism is any mining that's linked to quote unquote green technologies like solar panels, lithium batteries. And those technologies are called green. Not per se because they have no environmental impacts in their manufacturing, but because they're meant to help us transition to a zero emissions energy system, and that is better for the climate and the natural environment. And so, and I'm just saying that again, relatively neutrally. We can interrogate everything I just said if we want to, but mining for the energy transition, that's one way to define it. Another is like more critical, which thinks about, well, maybe the fact that all this new mining is needed for the energy transition gives a great opportunity for mining companies to like proclaim themselves as like the saviors of the planet, which they definitely do. And so this is, we can also use this concept much more critically to look at the way that green branding or greenwashing is leveraged by extractive firms because of their role in these green tech supply chains. But, however we define it, it's worth noting that it builds on like a more foundational concept, which is extractivism. And extractivism, while again sounding like a very technical academic term and has sort of become one, it didn't originate that way. My first book, Resource Radicals, really traces this concept as one that was generated in the heat of social struggle and left-wing intellectual critique in Latin America, not from academia, but from people on the ground that were trying to describe the system that they live in. And so extractivism names specific things, and it's different than extraction, which might be a broader term. Like many human societies, even pre-capitalist, engaged in forms of mining, like indigenous civilizations used metals for ceremonial or economic purposes. But extractivism is the type of extraction that's inaugurated with the instantiation of global capitalism and with the connection between capitalism and colonialism and imperialism later on. And so when we talk about extractivism, we're talking about a certain scale of appropriation from nature that's very large scale, very territorially expansive, that serves export markets and that serves supply chains that span the world. For this reason, Jason Moore, who you may be familiar with or not, he's an eco-Marxist, I guess, scholar, and he calls these extractive frontiers commodity frontiers because the point of not only because the raw materials are commodified, but they all serve the production of commodities under capitalism. These commodity markets for copper, for oil, for LNG, gas, for lithium, for any of these products are very volatile, which is another feature of extractivism, the kind of economic volatility. And the other thing that I want to mention is that it's not a purely economic phenomena. Extractivism is very politically ingrained where it exists as a kind of mode of accumulation. So another way that I phrase this, and this may or may not make sense to folks in the room, depending on your background, but Stuart Hall, who's a Marxist cultural theorist, had a really memorable phrase that I'm using, I'm riffing on, so to speak. What he said is, race is the modality through which class is lived. He wanted to explain that race is a way that class is experientially, experienced in a concrete way. He was trying to connect race and class. Here I'm connecting extractivism and capitalism, which are they're deeply intertwined, but the intervention I'm making here is that it's in the peripheries of the world, in marginalized, formerly colonized places, where extractivism is what capitalism looks like. It's how capitalism is experienced. And so what this does is kind of connect the present day of these new supply chains and their new mining frontiers with a longue durée history of capitalism that, we could say, there are many origins of capitalism. We could go to colonization, as I do here. We could talk about slavery and racial capitalism. We could talk about the invention of finance as a kind of capitalist enterprise, maybe in like Italian city-states. We could go to the Industrial Revolution in England. All of these are valid ways to think about where did capitalism begin, but wherever it precisely began, it became very intertwined with colonialism and imperialism. And so looking at the current green technologies and the mining they require through this lens helps situate us in this longer history where there have been unequal relationships between different places on Earth. Those inequalities have both economic and ecological dimensions. And we could even call, as scholars do, today's like peripheries as green sacrifice zones, places where, in the name of greening other places, perhaps there's sacrifice in the form of the kind of really devastating environmental impacts and also social and human rights impacts of mining. So this kind of raises this very important question, which is, whether green extractivism is just like a green face of colonialism, like nothing has changed in 500 years, or things have changed to some degree, even if they relate to this history. And maybe they've changed quite radically. Maybe we're in a new political economy of extraction because of just the changes in the world system in recent decades or even just recent years, because history feels like it's moving so quickly. Just as to, so we know where we're going with this presentation, I think it's some of both. I think there's a lot of continuity and structural legacies of prior eras of colonialism and extractivism and imperialism. But also, I think there's a lot of new things that history would not itself lead you to believe. Like, you need to be present in the moment and understand what's happening today. So, the way that I approach it this way in the book, though, again, I'm using slightly more, we could say, elevated language right now, to speaking among people with more shared political background, that I like to take continuities seriously, because I think, history weighs on the present, it structures the present, it's hard to escape history, maybe impossible. But also, history is not dispositive fully, meaning history doesn't fully determine the future. There are openings and contingencies, and there's change. And so, in analyzing the present day of extraction linked to the energy transition, we need to avoid certain pitfalls that, like, a very static analysis might lead us to trip over. One is we have to account for the ways that the world system has seriously changed, even, very much in my own lifetime. I'm I guess 42 years old, and if I had been working on this research topic a decade ago, even, I might not have really taken stock of how incredibly important China and the Chinese economy has become to the entire world system, and how threatening that fact has become to global North powers. And so, that China's rise alone is reason to just, kind of think critically about our prior assumptions. Like, is it necessarily the case that, like, the global North or the US is always hegemonic? No, apparently. And so, again, we need to attend to these changes. I also, think it's important to avoid deterministic thinking, like, just because copper exists in this place, it's automatically going to be a sacrifice zone. Or just because this place has in the past been, a site of extraction means it always will be. That's not true. And in fact, there are examples where we can see countries change their economic path. But even if we're not looking at the whole national scale, a given mining project may not actually move forward because there's quite a bit of conflict over mining, both local conflict, but also geopolitical conflict. And, what we see, instead of really, like, rigid, completely self-reproducing frontiers of extraction, are shifts in where extraction is taking place. We see both continuity and change. So we see, like, new resources become important. Like, I'm talking about the energy transition. I could also be talking about AI, data centers, military hardware. There's all sorts of technologies that require new or different mixes of minerals. And that means that, like, where extraction takes place might change. In addition, states play a really important role in shaping extraction. And that will be a really key point that will come out multiple times today in our talk. This is not to say corporations or the profit motive or private finance is not important. It is extremely important, but in a causal way. But in resource extraction in general, states are more involved than in other economic sectors. I'll just make that general claim, which I can support if anyone wants to ask me about it. But even if that general wasn't the case, like, today, for absolutely sure, states from the US government to Chile to the DRC, like, states in radically different economic and political positions in the world systems, are taking pretty intervening roles into mineral sectors, not always for good reasons or with good outcomes. Like would just be state intervention is not necessarily like socialism, right? Or a progressive policy, but it's not, you can't understand these sectors by only looking at market actors. We do see, though, among market actors, like changing corporate strategies. I'll get into that. And we also see, in relation both to state policies and corporate strategies, like new forms of socio-environmental struggle. So I just listed for you four ways in which four sets of forces that are shaping extractive frontiers that make us attentive to the ways that they might be changing in the present. An argument that I'll kind of make throughout this talk is that those changes in what's being extracted, under what terms, where, to whose benefit, etc., those dynamic qualities of extraction are rooted in contradictions. And I think that's a basic Marxist insight, that contradictions create dynamic opportunities, not to be really simplistic about it. Like it's not, and those opportunities may not tend towards social progress, but, it's just not the case that all elites agree or all corporations agree or all communities agree. There are really deep political divides and social and economic divides over extraction, and that creates a dynamic quality. Maybe the most central contradiction of green extractivism is the kind of obvious one, which is that we're like destroying sometimes or really undermining the viability of a particular ecosystem or habitat or watershed in the name of like saving the planet. And that reads like a contradiction, and it should. It's in tension. That tension motivates my whole work on this. But that's a rather obvious one, I think, to anyone in this room. I want to talk about maybe less expected contradictions of green extractivism that again create this dynamic, conflictual, contested quality. And these are four big ideas that I'm laying out that will, hopefully become even clearer as I go on. But one is that we have this seeming contradiction between more and more mining happening in the global north. That's called onshoring, to try to, bring mining home, so to speak, onshoring. Whereas we also still have even much more mining in the global south, and that inequality between the two persists. So those seem in tension a little bit, and so that's something we have to grapple with. We have tensions at various moments in terms of economic policy and kind of national security policy between like hawks, people that in the state, in the US state or whatever state, but the US is a great example, that really care about the security of supply chains and the national security interests of certain technologies. And then you have transnational capital, who are the ones actually investing in these projects and technologies, but have a more transnationalist, globalist, whatever we want to call it, kind of perspective, because they, they relate to global markets, global forms of investment. And so there might be this tension there as well. We also have a tension between different fragments of capital, we might call them, or sectors of capital. Finance and extraction are the ones I'm looking at here. And we might kind of conflate those sometimes, which I hear leftists do a lot. Like there's, the finance sector is extractive, or the extraction sector is fully financialized. And those are true statements, but they are a little simplistic, because in reality, if you get into the world of these businesses and see what's happening a little more on the inside, what you see is that there's often a tension between financiers and mining companies, or maybe tension is the wrong word. There's a misalignment, because the financial system likes very quick returns, and mining is a very time intensive, slower to profitability, longer term set of processes. And there are yet more tensions, but I'll just leave it at that. So it can be hard for mining companies to raise money. That's not for us to feel bad for them, but it's just to understand how capitalism works. The last, and I don't dwell as much on this in the talk, but I just want to bring it up because I think it's very germane to maybe people in this room, is that, there is a potential tension on the left. Is our goal anti-extractivism, like in a really holistic way, like we don't want any resource extraction, whatever that would look like, for human society? Or do we want extraction, but not extractivism, like a different form of appropriation from nature, and with perhaps more democracy, more planning, more of the public sector involved. Those are pretty different ideas. So, you know, these contradictions, especially the ones among elite actors, are very related to this emergence or reemergence of this geoeconomics trend. What geoeconomics is, I'm at the top of the slide right now, is an idea that is now very popular among political leaders, like everywhere in the world, maybe, but especially for sure in the US, that national security and the economy are the same. That, the stronger your economy is, the better your standing in like geopolitics, that certain technologies and forms of economic development are really crucial to geopolitical power. Of course, this should bring to mind the competition between the US and China over some of the most advanced technologies, whether semiconductors, lithium batteries, whatever they are. And so geoeconomics is, again, just a worldview that fuses national security and economic functioning and output. And, this is not a new idea at all. We could say that resource imperialism, across the 20th, late 19th to through mid 20th century at least, is a form of geoeconomics, maybe. But things did change since then. There was a whole neoliberal period, which, depending on who you ask, we are still in, or maybe we're not in, or we're at the tail end of it or something. But there was a period of, kind of much more free trade, quote unquote, deregulation, states being in some ways less involved in certain aspects of the economy, but also more globalization, so that resource frontiers were really far away. And you didn't really think about them that much. You didn't really think that much about where the mining minerals came from, you in this room, or you if you were a political leader in the global north. But that, and this just exemplifies that in data, basically showing that for 50 years to a century, like global north countries became very reliant on importing minerals. So a move away from like resource imperialism, where you directly secured resources, to more corporate-led globalization, let's say, and more dispersed supply chains. But that has changed today. Not just today, but like over the past several years now, maybe over the past decade, we could say, starting with Trump's first government, really picking up steam under Biden, and now even more under Trump too, where instead of like out of sight, out of mind with mining and raw materials, there's this idea that we should bring it home, as I said, onshoring, or that we should think with a security lens about supply chains. They're not just economic, they're geopolitical. And then today we have this on steroids with what I've called in some of my writing Trump's right-wing resource nationalism, and perhaps a return to classical resource imperialism with his threats against Greenland and his, consecrated threats in Venezuela and the taking over of the oil industry there. So in the book, I argue that this current moment of onshoring has like a whole history to it. I'm like a little hesitant to delve into this too much here, just because it might be a little bit of a digression. But I guess the main point I want to make, first of all, is that this does have a history, meaning as much as this seems like a new pivot in our current moment, and that's how I just kind of described it, the roots of this pivot are actually in the 1970s. Which was another moment, and some of you may remember, I saw a few elder folks in the room, like may have been alive, may remember this directly. It was a little before I was born, but, it is in, not so distant history, the 1970s. There was a so-called energy crisis, an oil crisis. I don't love that terminology because it's a very global north-centric way of looking at it. It was a oil crisis in some ways for the global north, but for oil producing states, it was like a great resource boom. But that little thing aside, in the 1970s is where we see a kind of origin point to the global north idea that we should bring resources closer to home, in that case, energy resources. So in response to global south, we would then say third world, attempts to nationalize and have sovereignty over their resources, there were global north moves, especially in the US and UK, to open up more nearby resource frontiers in the North Sea of the United Kingdom, in Alaska of the US, in the Gulf of Mexico, where a lot of our oil industry is still concentrated today. And so that onshoring move is kind of, I date it to the 70s. But then we have, and I'll move a little quicker now because these will be even more familiar to folks, but we have a number of moments where global now north power over resources and global north access to resources is called into question. That happens during the in the kind of overlapping with the financial crisis in a way during the commodity boom, which overlaps with that time period. That was a moment earlier this millennium when there were really high prices for raw materials, and this kind of started to freak out global north actors, because they were so used to, like, quote unquote cheap raw materials. But China's rapid industrialization and urbanization processes really put a lot of pressure on those raw material markets because China started importing so much, whether again beef or oil or copper or iron ore, like whatever raw material, China was importing it like way more than before, and that put some pressure on these markets and certainly started to worry global north or Western leaders, who were anyway worried because China was industrializing rapidly and economically ascendant. And so then you have these like emerging tensions between the US and China. They get ramped up under the first Trump. They really get, again, like intensified under Biden. And both Trump and Biden, Trump 1 and Biden, like really lean into this idea that we should have critical minerals closer to home. We need supply chain security. Biden ties that much more to the energy transition. For Trump, it's a bit more vague because he doesn't care about an energy transition, but he does care about what he calls mineral dominance. So in Trump 2, which I don't have here because it's not part of my history, it's like the present that we're living in Trump 2, this has even gotten accelerated with some interesting policy moves that I'll get to a little bit later. So, what has this looked like in practice? We have, first of all, a whole number of laws and regulations in the European Union and the US. So, these are two cases that I look at in the book to encourage more mining within our borders, within US borders, within EU borders. So, that's onshoring again. So, these are just summaries of different pieces of legislation that are trying to achieve that. You have more tariffs. So that's not so on the one side, we're encouraging more mining in the US for these ideas that it's more secure, it's in our national interest to have access to these minerals. But you also have tariffs, which reduce imports of those. So you're kind of, using both of those tools to generate more of a domestic mining industry. And also, and I know this is a lot of information, so don't worry about it too much, but the basic point of it is just that a lot of public money, meaning taxpayer funded, subsidies and tax breaks and loans and all manner of kind of incentives have been offered to mining companies, both in the European Union and the US, in order to get them to try to mine, within the European Union and US. One reason for that might be useful to know is that, or one reason so much money is being thrown at these companies is that mining is somewhat more expensive, we could say, in the global north. Like the cost of land and labor and the operational costs are higher. That has a whole history that relates to colonialism and the kind of cheapening of land and labor in the global south. But it is nevertheless the case. And so if you want a mining company to operate in the US instead of Zimbabwe, you're going to have to perhaps entice them with incentives. But, there are other reasons too, like corporate lobbying. There's lots of reasons why all this money is being thrown at these companies. But the big reason from a state perspective is because the national security interest is just so important that we can spend whatever, right? We always know that anything can be spent when it relates to, quote, national security or war. And so that's exemplified here. I just want to draw our attention, and this is what I was mentioning a moment ago. At the very bottom in the US category, we have a lot of interesting moves on the part of the Trump government. In fact, a more interventionist policy with regards to mining, including the US government or US government agencies becoming partial owners, taking equity stake positions in various mining companies. This is very recent. It's totally unprecedented in US history. And in addition, Trump just very recently decided to outlay $10 billion from a U.S. bank that's usually not used for this purpose, to set up a mineral stockpile. That's like, again, for quote unquote security reasons. So we get the idea. There's a lot of public money is being thrown at this idea that we should onshore mining and have mining closer to home. And it's having some effects in the world. meaning that it's not just money chasing after nothing. It is creating more mining projects in the global north. The map on the left is a little bit dated, but I like to use it because it shows you the kind of height of the recent kind of mining boom. This is from late 22, maybe early 23, thereabouts, and there were like 100 different projects being proposed in the Western U.S. That's the part of the country we're looking at. And then in Europe, a dozen projects or whatever it is. And not all those projects will move forward. In fact, as you see on the Europe map, some of them are marked as like citizen protests, and the same in the US. But there was a real lithium rush, and it's cooled a little bit because the prices for lithium have dropped. You'll see that in a moment. But even if like 10 of these 100 projects happen, it's a huge change to the Western US landscape. And they wouldn't have happened without the policy support from Trump 1, Biden, and Biden 2. Or excuse me, Trump 2. So that we see what's happening in the global north. But I'm kind of now immediately bringing in something else, which is that that's not the whole story, and it may not even be the main story. The main story is that most of these minerals are going to come from the global south for the foreseeable future. I already mentioned that before, but now I'm showing you graphically that Latin America, Indonesia, and Africa really account for like the lion's share of minerals for export. I'm intentionally not saying China, even though it's kind of high on that mining list, and I'm just looking at mining, not refining right now, because China, I think this is generally the case, generally true what I'm about to say, doesn't really export these minerals. In fact, due to the refining capacity that you see on the right-hand side, they refine them, they process them, domestically, and they use them domestically in their economy, and then they might be exported, but in the form of like a product. Like China has lithium mining within China. That lithium can then create lithium batteries, and then those lithium batteries might be exported, but China's not in the business of exporting raw materials. So I'm putting China aside because what we're looking at here is like what countries are providing to the rest of the world, including China, i.e., like which countries are exporting and producing and exporting tons of minerals that relate to these supply chains. And that's where we see Latin America, Indonesia, and Africa. And, that is a not great position to be in the world economy. It is the least value added, which is a kind of economic term that may or may not be familiar to folks, but the economic value of the raw material is less, somewhat categorically, or almost just as like a rule of economics. The value of the raw material is less than the value of the product that raw material factors into. So the real economic action is in producing lithium batteries, not in extracting lithium. So, the fact that, just to go back for a moment, many global south countries find themselves in the position of being primarily extractive economies doesn't bode well for like their economic development necessarily, which is a reason that many of them are trying to change their position in the world economy. But I'll come to that in a moment. Another thing that is not ideal about extraction in the global south, especially, is it's extremely violent. It's associated with a lot of violence, outright killings of people, a lot of human rights allegations, and this is no different than mining not for the energy transition. Like if you looked at gold or some other sector, again, like the energy transition mining is just the same as any other mining. It just has a different end use, but the violence, the inequality, the volatility of these markets is all the same as any kind of raw material market. So I'm gonna kind of skip ahead a little bit here, and I want to go into the corporate sector a little bit, and the kind of green capitalist, quote unquote. And by that, I do not mean that capitalism is green in like a sustainable sense. I just mean green sectors, whoever's labeling them, like the battery sector, the EV sector, the solar panel sector, like those sectors which are called green by someone. Again, I'm not per se endorsing that terminology necessarily, but I'm just looking at the capitalists in those sectors, both the corporations and who finances them. And those are to some degree distinct. Of course, a large corporation to an extent can self-finance, also, but it partly does so through selling shares. And so even then there's shareholders involved, and then there might be institutional shareholders or larger shareholders. Other companies, may be more reliant on debt. There are different ways that capitalism, that we finance things under capitalism. But, an interesting thing to note is that, and this is something I said earlier, is that it can be difficult for mining companies to attract enough investment. That is not to feel bad for them, nor is it to say it would be so much better if they could attract more investment. It's just a simple, objective description that they would like more money to explore more territories and open up more resource frontiers. And the private financial sector, as we have it organized in the West or in the global North, is not that interested in financing that. They'd rather, do the next tech bubble or like whatever it is, but they're not interested in this longer term, riskier form of investment that is a, 30-year mining project. And there was a momentary exception to that during the last commodity boom, which I mentioned just a moment ago. But we've never recovered the exploration budget since then. So there's a little bit of a tension there between mining companies trying to garner financing and that not always being forthcoming. And what can make this worse is how volatile the prices are, because when the prices go up, as they were a couple years ago, like record high prices for lithium, then mining companies have less trouble attracting investment, which is why we got that rush or boom that I showed you in the Western US. But when prices crash, which they sort of inevitably do, and I can explain why it's somewhat inevitable, but there's a structural reason that these boom and bust cycles happen. When they go down, the prices, then investors are like, oh, these projects are less profitable, and so I'm going to withdraw my investment. And what's interesting is what happens then, and so I'm just overlaying a few different images here, is that mining companies often ask the state for more money. The state, the government, I mean, all those tax breaks, all that public financing I mentioned, like becomes even more crucial when prices are low. And I just can't overstate how much mining companies in the global north are extremely and increasingly dependent on direct public financial support, on the tax breaks, on the subsidies, on whatever, and that support does not replace private investment. It enables it. So when Trump has directed agencies to U.S. agencies, the Department of Energy, the so-called Department of War, the Commerce Department, these agencies now own 10% of this mine, 15% of that mine, and they don't think of that as socialism. I mean, we could talk about that, we could have that conversation, but they think of it as this is a necessity to attract private capital that's not that interested in these projects, but that are so important to our national security. So just to give you a sense of how the market dynamics interact with the policy and financial support from the government, and then interact back with the private finance getting actually more interested once government gets involved. It's a little different from how we might think about these in other sectors. So, maybe just one last thing to mention about the corporations before moving to the global south, which is the kind of last portion of this talk, is that they're doing some interesting things. Besides eating up a lot of public money, they're also themselves kind of similar to government actors, like less sanguine, less rosy or optimistic about, let's say, like global trade being smooth and predictable. So and they see the geopolitical turbulence very clearly. And so what some car companies and battery companies are doing is actually directly investing in mining companies or in mining projects or becoming joint ventures with them. This is kind of similar to what was called Fordism. Henry Ford innovated this kind of vertically integrated supply chain, and we see a little bit of a return to it. So I'm going to skip this, skip that, skip this. Okay. So, just to move to the final kind of moments of this presentation, we already know that despite all of this action in the global north and the ways that the global north is trying to get mining companies to invest more in their geographies, the global south is where a lot of the mining is going to happen, where most of it's going to happen for the foreseeable future. And that fact is not lost on global south governments, who see this as a potentially historic opportunity to develop on the back of their, critical mineral deposits, whether lithium or cobalt or nickel or copper. And so we see a lot of interesting moves of resource nationalism, of industrial policy, of attempts at coordination between different global south states to like try to leverage their resource deposits into like green economic development. That's really hard to do though. And this is very cursory, or it's just a very like thin overview of the problems, but I'm happy to talk more about it in Q&A. But there are a lot of obstacles to that. It's not actually so easy, and it rarely has proven easy historically, to move from being like a primary resource extractor and exporter to being like an industrial power. As I mentioned, for anyone that maybe remembers this point, it can happen. Extractivism is not, guaranteed. There are other options out there, and there are countries that have like moved past that mode of development, but it's hard. And it might be even harder in this geopolitical moment of a lot of tensions and kind of countries feeling like they have to choose sides between the US and China. Or, some people argue that that's helpful. It's good to have competition for the global south or over the global south. That's better than just unilateral hegemony on the part of the US. It's better that, the global south kind of can choose whether it's Chinese investment or Western. But, it's certainly complex. There's also a lot of issues of distribution, like who's going to benefit, how are we going to distribute the proceeds of extraction. That can often be contentious in these places where mining takes place. And then there's, of course, increasing social and environmental conflict. And I really mean it when I say increasing. Mining was not always, the main conflict around mining was not always environmental issues like 50 years ago, 100 years ago, but it really is today. Environmental issues, indigenous rights, local and community, concerns, like these have become major points of conflict in the mining industry. And I should say, also, those same movements may protest governments, even progressive governments or, relatively competent governments in the global south that are trying to push for like this green developmental strategy. These social and environmental movements may not agree with that or may not like the local impacts of that in terms of mining projects. So we see a lot of protest around mining around the world. We see it historically, in recent history, in places where lithium was already being developed in Latin America. But as the mining frontier has moved in Europe and the US, we've seen protests there too. We've also seen very recent and ongoing protests in Latin America. This protest take all sorts of forms like road blockades, protest camps, big mass demonstrations. And, some of my work has really been to understand the dynamics of protest and visit places, especially before mining happens, where protests can be quite militant because you're trying to stop the project altogether. On the left, this Portugal project is still not moved forward because of protest and among other reasons. On the right, this project, Thacker Pass, which is in Nevada, and benefit a lot from both Biden and Trump policies, is moving forward. So what it looks like is it looks different now because that mine is actually under construction. This is when I did field work a few years ago. So I think there's a lot of interesting aspects of socio-environmental protest. I just list some ideas here. But what I want to get to and end with is that, there is this question, which I kind of put in a black box throughout this talk, of like how much mining is really needed, especially if mining does generate conflict, if mining is tricky to govern in the global south or anywhere, tricky to get economic development out of mining, like how much mining is really needed. If wherever the resource frontier goes, you have the possibility of conflict, of these human rights violations, of environmental contamination, maybe we should be thinking about a way to get to our energy transition goals of zero emissions energy without as much mining as the most alarming forecasts. And I did some research with some colleagues, and we found out that that is possible. Not less mining, not less lithium mining than today, but less lithium mining than those forecasts of, the ones I showed you at the beginning of this talk. If we take certain measures, policy measures, changes to consumer habits, changes to how batteries are produced, more recycling, more mass transit, denser urban environments, all sorts of things that reduce car use or reduce the material intensity of batteries or make sure that they're made with recycled materials rather than new mining. So I'll end the talk there, and with whatever remains, I think a little under 30 minutes, I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, thanks, Thea, very much. A lot of very interesting material to absorb. Just want to entertain questions and comments now from anyone who has a point to make or a question to raise.
There is a question in the chat that I'm happy to start with. But
let's start with that. What is that? What is that question?
Well, you answered it, but I can speak to it a little bit.
Yeah, I gave a very short answer. But,
yeah, that's fine. So Wolf asked if fossil fuels count as extraction. So absolutely, but maybe I'll say a couple of things about it. So yeah, I've been emphasizing in this talk because of just like the topic of my research, mining, like mining of a metal, lithium is technically a metal. And I haven't been emphasizing fossil fuel extraction, not because it's unimportant or it's a massive extractive sector unto itself, just because, what I was looking at was the extraction related to the energy transition. But there's a couple of really important aspects to your point. One is that, we already live in an extremely extractive economy. So the point of my work, my book, my talk today is not to say the energy transition involves like more extraction, though on a product by product level it might. Like for example, an electric vehicle does involve more mining than a traditional vehicle, mainly because of the battery, but also the electric motor, which has rare earths in it and whatnot. So we can do these comparisons, but if we zoom out, like absolutely, we live in a fundamentally extractive economy and an even worse one than the type of extractive economy we could have with renewable energy. Not the one we are having, but could in theory. So I'll explain what I mean. Today, what we extract for lots of things, but in terms of fossil fuels, those are extracted to burn as fuel. Like we just burn them. We extract them, we burn them, we never get them back. And even worse, they go into the atmosphere as carbon or methane, as greenhouse gases, and they create the climate crisis. So we live in an extractive economy that's extremely wasteful because an extraordinary amount of extraction happens and it's all just combusted and burned. The renewable energy economy is potentially different. And I underscore potentially because this is not the way it's being organized now, but in theory it could be, which is a much less extractive economy over the longer durée, where you have a moment of extraction in order to create the batteries, the solar panels, whatever, but you don't need to like recreate those every day and they're not being burned. They're being like reused in practice. And so you could potentially taper off extraction once you kind of build the physical environment, the built environment of a renewable energy system. What's more, as I kind of mentioned a moment ago, all of that is recyclable. Not that recycling has no environmental harm. It does. So I don't want to make it sound like Pollyannish or perfect, but certainly I think it's probably better to manage the environmental harms of a recycling plant than to destroy like primary rainforest to build a nickel mine. Like those are both harmful, but one is dramatically more harmful. And by the way, destroying rainforests or any intact ecosystem contributes to the climate crisis in a variety of ways. It unleashes carbon and it destroys the ability of the planet to absorb carbon. So anyway, in theory, like the mining for the energy transition is to create durable goods rather than fuel. And it also is recyclable and recoverable. So those are things we should think about as, I don't know what people's politics exactly are in the room, but if you're like an eco-socialist, that's like interesting. That's helpful. It's just, again, the powers that be are not like fully leveraging that circular economy, sustainable possibility. And so what we have instead is simultaneous fossil fuel extraction, because we're not keeping that in the ground, apparently, and a lot of new mining for different purposes, energy transition, AI, data centers, semiconductors, whatever. And so we have like all of the above extraction. And that's the worst of all worlds. We're not really like moving from one extractive regime to another. We're like doubling, tripling, whatever, more than that. And, if you think about the fact that like 14 or 15 million barrels of oil a day are extracted just for US ground transportation. I mean, and then to think about like all these lithium mines for like the lithium batteries, but we're not really transitioning our auto sector. It's like, it's a lot of stress on the planet. And so we need to think in these holistic terms. But we should hold on to a little bit of hope is the wrong word, but hold on to that positive potential that a zero emissions, like more renewable energy economy could in total be less extraction if we create it correctly.
Jack,
Oh,
you were,
and Wolf, right. Okay, you just got me. Yeah, I was only talking about the minerals, so good catch, but the fuel for that car makes it much more extractive in other ways. So it just depends how we measure it. I belabor this over like 3 pages in the book because I think it's very interesting to compare traditional car, EV, and like think about them from 8 different angles. In the end, EVs are better for the climate. I'll just say that, but they may be worse for the time being for local ecosystems because they do involve more mining.
Jack, go ahead.
Yes. Excuse me. Yes, thank you. Very interesting presentation. There's a lot in it. And I am planning to read the book, so I'm looking forward to it very much. I do have two questions slash comments about things that, in one case you didn't completely leave out, but you underplayed it, and the other you did leave out. The first one, when Evo Morales said that he was nationalizing the natural gas, which he didn't really nationalize, but he did exert more authority, more dominance over it, he said he had to do this to provide revenues to bring people out of poverty. And I'm just curious how you would respond to that argument.
Mhm.
My second point, you didn't say anything about the fabled resource curse and
Mhm.
whether reliance on lithium is going to, first of all, it could be a flash in the pan. It could not pan out in the long term. But second, if the theory of the resource curse applies here, it could lead to the creation of structures that actually get in the way of development in the sense of, a social needs kind of oriented kind of development, a kind of development that would be self-maintaining, but also lead beyond itself to being able to concentrate on more traditional, exportable, ultimately more profit-making kinds of goods. So I'd like to hear your reaction to
Yeah,
that.
really, really great questions that I've thought a lot about, so I'm happy to answer them. And yeah, can't say it all. So I didn't talk about any of these points directly in the talk, but I will say that especially on the resource curse, well, actually on all 2 to 3 of your questions, I kind of count 3 questions actually. These are addressed maybe even more in my earlier book, Resource Radicals, where I really hone in on the kind of internal politics in the global south of extraction and really particularly look at the different politics of anti-extraction versus resource nationalism and what the different claims are. So you're asking me to say more about this quote resource nationalism or nationalization idea and also about the resource curse. So, first of all, you're correct, but I want to make sure everyone else understands that like today when the word nationalize is used, it doesn't mean what it used to mean. And we should be aware of that as perhaps leftists, Marxists, I don't know, again, I don't want to like judge everyone's politics in the room, but we want to know what these terms actually mean. And in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, actually 1920s, I do talk about this in Extraction in the book that you're going to read, how the earliest cases of resource nationalization outside of the Soviet Union were in Latin America. And that's a very interesting history. So it starts as early as the 1920s. But okay, I digress. We have half a century of nationalization, 1920s to 1970s, in which nationalization means what we might think it means, which is like a government takes an asset from a private company, usually a foreign capital, but sometimes domestic, takes it into public ownership and develops it for some purpose that's usually linked to economic development, however that's conceived. That transfer of property, that asset expropriation, is not usually what happens anymore when governments like Evo Morales a decade ago or whatever said, more than a decade ago, I'm dating myself, a couple decades ago, wow, said I'm going to nationalize gas, for example. He said that, but that's not in a standard definition of nationalization, that's not what happened. What happened is this Bolivian state, and it sounds like you're aware of this, but just for other people, took a 51% ownership position in renegotiated contracts. So they were the majority owner of like a project, not of even the whole company, but let alone the shareholder owned firms still own the other 49%. And this is now what nationalization has come to be. It's like a forced renegotiation of contracts, like forced in the sense that companies don't want this to happen. The state makes the move, but the state doesn't fully expropriate. It becomes like a joint venture or partner. We could ask why this moderation? There's many reasons, but one has to do with the fact that international investment law, which by the way, literally developed to react as a counter reaction to resource nationalism, like in the 30s through 70s, like modern day investment law, like one of its origins is to discipline the global south, is to say, no, you're not allowed to do this because investors have rights. Investors have rights to their property, their profits. And so the laws and the investor dispute settlement mechanisms in international trade and finance and investment law are just, you get fined millions of dollars if you do something like that. You get fined even if you do the more moderate version. So, and I'm not excusing moderation, I'm just explaining these are the structural dynamics. So, okay, nationalization is not the old kind of nationalization, it's something different, but it's still like a muscular state intervention into the economy. And the goal in left-wing governments of the Latin American variety especially is to use the resources for like social good in some way. We're going to develop these resources, we're going to extract them, we're going to export them just like we did before. So it doesn't really change the model of accumulation, but it does change where the rents, which is a technical term for like the royalties and taxes that are derived from extraction, it changes where the rents go. Instead of purely going to the company, they also go to pay for public infrastructure, to pay for healthcare, sanitation, housing. And this happened, and I sense that you know that because you said that. Like it really did occur in Bolivia and Venezuela and Ecuador and Brazil, in Uruguay, and a bunch of like these pink tide, this is earlier in the 2000s, like governments did actually use resource rents to fund social welfare programs. And that all had an effect. Dramatic reductions in poverty, reductions of inequality in the most unequal continent on the planet, like really major advances, except at the expense of a lot of environmental contamination and land grabbing and indigenous dispossession. And we have to evaluate those different leftist ideas and goals against one another. But all of that, check. And then the last thing is resource curse. So I don't agree with the idea of a resource curse. That doesn't mean I don't think resource dependent economies have a lot of like dilemmas and kind of like tend to self reproduce themselves and don't tend to generate the kind of development or political outcomes that are ideal. But the resource curse is too deterministic. So for people not aware, there's two versions that the resource curse takes, political and economic. The political idea is that places with a lot of oil or a lot of minerals and that have their economy based on that are more authoritarian. That's a political resource curse. The economic is also called Dutch disease, which is that when you specialize in a resource extraction sector, it's really hard to diversify your economy, therefore hard to, quote, develop, industrialize. You have this really monocultural economy. And I don't, that one actually has more to it. I think the political resource curse, it's based on like a case study of Saudi Arabia. Like there are lots of non-authoritarian contexts of resource extraction. And if anything, and this is the argument I make in Resource Radicals, and we can communicate later, I can direct you to the pages of that book, but where I argue like actually, especially in the present day, resource economies have a lot of social contention, social conflict. Those can lead to different political projects, right and left. Like they don't all just tend to dictatorship. That's not true. So, however, I do think, as I said throughout this talk, that it is hard for structural reasons of different sorts to get out of the trap of extractivism once you're in it. But that's a little different than saying you automatically become a dictatorship. The other thing about the resource curse is it doesn't address capitalism. It's like the resources are the causal factor, not the structures of global capitalism. So I take issue with that. But excellent questions. Thank you, Jack. Fred has a hand up. I don't know if there's anyone else in the chat or wherever.
Yeah, so I have a question that just in the last few weeks, I've been seeing and reading a lot about the sudden explosion of AI data centers in the U.S. and along with that, an explosion of protest and opposition to these data centers. And it seems to me that's a whole new area of extraction.
Yeah.
That is, in the first instance, it's extraction in situ. It's draining aquifers. It's, monopolizing water resources. And it's causing, electric rates to skyrocket in some places. And then in turn, the power demands of these data centers is going to, fuel fossil fuel extraction, or become a whole nother area where solar panels, windmills, all of those are going to be demanding more mineral resources for their construction. So I just, maybe it's more of a comment than a question, but it just seems to add a whole nother layer to your cases and arguments.
Yeah, 100%. And I won't repeat what you said, but I co-sign everything you said. I'll add a couple of additional points on that. One thing that's clearly happening with AI, which AI is like, what is AI? I mean, that itself is a contested thing, but, I'm just talking about the kind of large language models that enable like ChatGPT or the generation of artificial images, or that are now resulting in certain forms of automation, new forms of automation within companies, like in some cases replacing human workers or partly replacing them. So that's what I'm saying by AI. I'm not getting into the philosophy of is there actually artificial intelligence. But anyway, all of that has a physical substrate to it. The computing technology is physical stuff. It's semiconductors, it's energy systems, it's these warehouses made of computational technology and backup energy storage in the form of lithium batteries, by the way, right? And so all of that requires like mining to produce. In addition, as you said, all of the energy that's used to power this stuff, and the water and the physical land as well. But the reason I'm framing it this way is that AI has become like a justification for more mining. Whether or not AI actually needs a tremendous amount of minerals, how much it needs, or whether there's more materially efficient ways to generate AI, whether or not we want AI or not, but that's a separate question. That's an engineering problem, and a technical problem and an empirical question. But for sure, the political effects are that it's creating another justification for mining. And in fact, Trump, when he says we need more lithium, rare earth, copper, he does not care about the energy transition. I mean, that's a polite way of saying like he is not in favor of an energy transition. He's dismantling what exists of one in the US, but he does like military tech and semiconductors and AI. And the existence of novel forms of military technology, drone-powered warfare, by the way, involves a lot of lithium batteries, right? Or AI, the data center, the energy backup is lithium batteries increasingly. So for him, it's like a reason to open up new resource frontiers. Like it's a new justification. When Biden would talk about green, we need this mining, we need these lithium mines for the energy transition, Trump has this other. So the more reasons there are for mining, the more reasons there are to give public money for it. So it almost like agnostic of the actual mineral requirements of a given data center, it's providing an excuse that is important. But then when we look at the actual metrics, it's a little confusing because, and I did this with rare earths recently for something I was writing, like Trump loves rare earths and wants more rare earths mining in the US and has bought into these mining companies. He wanted to take over Greenland for that reason, supposedly, etc. But when we look at where do rare earths actually go in the world, like actually a pretty small percentage go to either AI technologies or military technologies. As important as both of those are, the main destination for rare earths are the motors of wind turbines and the motors of electric vehicles. And so, Trump is doing a weird thing where he's saying, I want all these new rare earths, but he doesn't care about the main things that they go towards, right? So it's a little contradictory, and we need to sit with the fact that the energy transition technologies remain the number one consumer of these minerals, which makes it a little harder for the left because it would almost be easier if it was just militarism or big tech. Instead, even in a green utopia, would we need some lithium, right? It makes the problem a little more complicated that the villains are not the easy villains always. That said, absolutely AI is propelling more extraction in the form of energy, primary energy sources, land, and in terms of mineral extraction for these technologies. And what I just said about what is using more minerals, that could change in the future. It could be that AI, if it really takes off, becomes the number one consumer of rare earths or something, but that's not quite the case yet. It's still the energy transition sectors are the most important.
And of course, rare earths are not actually rare.
They're not rare, and lithium is not a rare earth, and these are
right.
things I clarify almost every time I talk. Yeah, they were called rare in the 18th century, when the geologists that discovered them thought they were rare. What they are, though, which is it's not exactly the same as being rare, but it's relevant, is that they are very low concentrations. So that means you have to mine a lot of land to get a little rare earths, and also you have to do a lot of processing and refining, which is very environmentally contaminating. But they're not rare like they barely exist or something. That's not the case.
Okay, further questions or comments from our group for Thea?
At my rate of answering, we probably have time for at least one more. I tend to answer a bit long, as we can see. But if anything else occurs to anybody, I'm with you for the next 8 minutes.
Okay, just checking the chat. See, I think that's about it.
But I know I talked a lot, and sometimes that has the impact of silencing people because they're thinking about the 50 ideas I just brought in. Thank you, Wolf. But yeah, I'll give us another moment. I'm a teacher, so I'm used to silence sometimes. Not a problem for me.
Right. Meanwhile, I will find the link to our study group. If anyone's not already enrolled in it, then
yeah,
you
please.
can
And
join us for
I hope that
further
and thank you
discussions
for
on
all
the book.
yeah, thanks for that, Fred, and thanks for the comments in the chat about the discussion. And just so everyone knows, reading the book will actually be easier than what you just listened to because it's written for people that have less background than you all do. And I mean that by people that they're less political in the way they think about the world. And so I have to speak to a more ordinary person. But on the other hand, there's also a lot of rich description, historical narrative, field work, so I hope, it should be an engaging read, but you don't need to be an expert at all to pick it up. Strange question. Okay, Jacqueline, I'll take it.
Yeah, thank you. This has been really informative. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. I have a very right-wing brother who's into energy production, and I was thinking that your book would really fascinate him from the things you've said, because he's always told me that leftists like me are willing to let other people suffer so that we have our electric cars. And I've tried to tell him that's not true. So I've wondered, what has the response been to your book in circles other than the left?
Yes, it's not a strange question. It's such a good one. And in fact, there's like two facets I want to talk about really quickly in our remaining moments. And the first one relates to did you say it was your brother?
Yes. It's a tragedy in the family.
It happens in many families. I get it. But yeah, in my own included. So yeah, but it's a bigger phenomena than just your brother. As often it is on the right, I mean, on the left too, but on the right wing, there's this really like vibrant, we could say, like ecosystem of all these discourses, conspiracy theories, and like what right-wing leaders say kind of is in this interaction with like ordinary right-wing people. And so it's interesting to look at, how these ideologies take root. But really specifically, what he's giving voice to about, oh, you left-wing people are such hypocrites because I mean, it used to be like, you have a cell phone, why are you so concerned about mining? Because but now it's like you have an electric vehicle. Anyway, so these ideas that we're hypocrites because we care about the environmental impacts, yet in some cases we might say these technologies have their roles. That is a really common type of criticism or discourse on the right, to the point where like you have in Congress hearings like instigated by right-wing, sometimes the most right-wing members of the GOP, of the Republican Party, saying we need to look into like these human rights abuses in the cobalt industry or because they want to like play gotcha, right? That stuff has quieted a little bit because Trump is so pro-mining that it's like a little bit weird to be like, we're going to call out the left-wing people on mining, but our president supports a lot of new mining. It's like, but under Biden, at that moment, you had a lot of this type of thing because it was like an easy gotcha. Like, oh, you're so environmentalist, but don't you know that like lithium mining hurts the environment? And so it's a cheap, critique, but it's not your brothers alone. There's a whole discursive universe around this stuff. So I just wanted to mention that. But secondly, um, I do sometimes get a different concern. And in fact, Fred came to a talk where I think this might have come up, an in-person talk I did in New York City, and I think this might have come up in that Q&A. I'm not, maybe I'm mixing it up with something else, but it's a common question that I get. Like, aren't you worried that like you're actually kind of undermining the energy transition by like talking about the negative aspects of it? Or aren't you worried, and I sometimes get this even more directly, like, aren't you worried that fossil fuel industry might like what you're saying? Because in effect, you're saying that EVs like have all these environmental harms, maybe traditional cars are better. That line of concern, which is not coming from the right, but it's coming from like, let's say, more mainstream climate people that are worried that any discussion of extraction and the energy transition is going to like complicate matters and make people, they're actually worried of like, that I'm going to feed into the kind of concerns that your right-wing brother has. Sorry, not to bring it too full circle. But I get it. But the thing is, and this kind of relates to the earlier questions about, is oil and extractive industry the kind of stuff we were just talking about? Like, these oil companies are not interested in like critiques of extractivism. I mean, they might again be interested sometimes in a really like superficial gotcha about electric vehicles, but someone like me or us in this room that's shining a really bright light on the environmental harms and political issues that relate to resource extraction, relate to oil and mining, oil and gas too, and coal, not just to metallic minerals. And interestingly, those oil companies are now investing in critical minerals and lithium, which is not surprising because they're extractive industries that are kind of adjacent to their own. So the plot thickens, like it's sort of complicated, but that's why I always try to be really clear that we already live in an extractive economy. We're talking about new or different forms of extraction, but that shouldn't take our attention fully away from like the fossil capitalism question and the fossil fuel question. And the fact that electric vehicles do come with harmful mining doesn't mean that traditional vehicles are better, or don't involve extraction, which they do. So it's a lot of like, it can sound a little like both sidesy, but that's the nature of the matter when you're dealing with extractive capitalism. It's already exists. It can continue to exist through an energy transition and through AI. And we need to be clear that what we're looking for, and this is kind of Jack was going here. Sorry, there are two Jacks, I guess. Jack Hammond in his questions to me. Like, what we really need to think about is like, how do we create an economy that's less resource intensive, or what Fred was asking about with AI? That should be our North Star, not necessarily saying like green extraction is better than fossil extraction or vice versa, but like, how do we create a less extractive type of economy? And that's what I was presenting at the end with like, if we implement practices that are, by the way, I know some of you are in New York City, or maybe all of you, I'm not sure, in a place like New York City with a wonderful mass transit system. And I know that there are all sorts of problems with the MTA. I'm from New York City, so I'm familiar. And yet it's like the best mass transit system in the US, right? I should be so lucky in Providence to have a bus that runs more than once an hour. So like, these are things that in some places already exist, alternatives to cars, but in other places like barely exist. And the more we can do that, then the less oil we need for the car gasoline, the less lithium we need for electric vehicles, because people are getting around in other ways. And so thinking holistically about just a more ecologically sustainable mode of production, I think will address all of these questions and will make us feel less, quote, hypocritical, right, as your brother might accuse you of being.
Thank you. Thank
No
you.
problem. And not a weird question at all. I mean, I know there's like a family element, but this is, as I said, it is just a right-wing discourse that I have to contend with all the time.
Okay, well, it's 30 minutes past the hour.
Oh, right on
30
time.
on the East Coast.
Yeah.
And you hit the mark. Thanks so much for this whole presentation and conversation, and we hope to see you again before long. What are you working on now in 25 words or less?
I continue to work on these topics, like in public writing and policy papers, working on, I'll have something that I'm co-writing right now with someone on Trump's interventions in critical minerals and what like right-wing resource nationalism and state capitalism means. So that will come out probably, I don't know, maybe later in March or early April, because we haven't submitted it yet. But you can follow me on all the terrible social media websites, from Twitter to LinkedIn to Blue Sky, Instagram. I use them all basically. And so that's a good way to keep up with my work, including that I post it on my website once it's actually published.